Okay, thanks, Todd. So this is from *Sapiens*, a book by Yuval Noah Harari, which Roy Hedin recommended to us in 2018 for our book review program. And it's especially interesting too, because he has a few descriptions of other kinds of humanism that it would be good to discuss at a later time. But he talks about the human evolution and the human cognitive revolution starting about 70,000 years ago in Homo sapiens. So I'm reading from pages 26 to 28. In the wake of the cognitive revolution, gossip helped Homo sapiens to form larger and more stable bands. But even gossip has its limits. Sociological research has shown that the maximum natural size of a group bonded by gossip is about 150 individuals. Most people can neither intimately know nor gossip effectively about more than about 150 human beings. Even today, a critical threshold in human organizations falls somewhere around this magic number. Below this threshold, communities, businesses, social networks, and military units can maintain themselves based mainly on intimate acquaintance and rumor mongering. There is no need for formal ranks, titles, and law books to keep order. A platoon of 30 soldiers, or even a company of 100 soldiers, can function well on the basis of intimate relations, with a minimum of formal discipline. But once the threshold of 150 individuals is crossed, things can no longer work that way. You cannot run a division with thousands of soldiers the same way you run a platoon. Successful family businesses usually face a crisis when they grow larger and hire more personnel. How did Homo sapiens manage to cross this critical threshold, eventually founding cities comprising tens of thousands of inhabitants and empires ruling hundreds of millions? The secret was probably the appearance of fiction. Large numbers of strangers can cooperate successfully by believing in common myths. Any large-scale human cooperation, whether a modern state, a medieval church, an ancient city, or archaic tribe, is rooted in common myths that exist only in people's collective imagination. Churches are rooted in common myths. Nations are rooted in common myths. Two Serbs who have never met might risk their lives to save one another because both believe in the existence of the Serbian nation. Two lawyers who have never met can nevertheless combine efforts to defend a complete stranger because they both believe in the existence of laws, justice, human rights, and the money paid out in fees. Yet none of these things exists outside the stories that people invent and tell one another. There are no gods in the universe, no nations, no money, no human rights, no laws, and no justice outside the common imagination of human beings.
Allison Pyrch is a native of Portland and an Oregon State educated geotechnical engineer. She is a long-term advocate for resilience planning in the Pacific Northwest to better enable rapid recovery from earthquakes and other disasters. To meet the need for comprehensive resilience planning, she founded Solace Resilience, a partnership of Hart Krauser and 2 other firms. She is active in the American Society of Civil Engineers Infrastructure Resilience Division and in developing the Oregon Resilience Plan. She has traveled in the last decade to Chile, Japan, and Mexico to study earthquake aftermath and recovery efforts. Through projects scattered all over our area, she has left her mark. The Elephant Lands exhibit at the Oregon Zoo, the Swabi Island Bridge, facilities at the Cascade Station development, and the Wilsonville I-5 interchange are a few of her projects. Notable among her awards is recognition as the American Society of Civil Engineers 2018 Oregon Southwest Washington Engineer of the Year and as a daily Journal of Commerce Woman of Vision. For leisure, she is a Rose Festival dragon boat captain, and she skis and hikes with her dogs in our beautiful mountains. She was prominently featured in the OPB documentary Unprepared, a look at Oregon's lack of preparedness for a major earthquake. In that documentary, in a scene filmed at the end of a long, demanding day, she was in the basement of a Japanese hospital that was built to that country's demanding earthquake-resistant standards. The building sits on more than 100 huge, spring-loaded, shock absorber-like structures. These structures are awesome. Pyrch was asked to comment on what she was seeing. Succinctly, she responded, "It's super cool. It's structural and geotechnical engineering porn. But I can't say that on TV, so can you please ask me a question my brain-dead self can answer without thinking?" Rather than a new question, the producers cut the last sentence and geotechnical porn went into the documentary and on the air. Another element of her fame.
Mm-hmm.
Today, she will speak to us on earthquake culture and why we need one.
As he said, I have been to Chile, Japan, and Mexico to study subduction zone earthquakes, and came back home. I'm going to talk a little bit today about what's been done, what to expect based on kind of what we've seen in our infrastructure here. So in all three earthquakes, the places that we saw damage are fairly obvious, but where we've got weak soils, weak infrastructure, or some unfortunate combination of the two. You can have structure damage because the structure. Landslides can also be caused by earthquakes. We have a problem with landslides here without shaking. Okay, so anything major that somebody had a question about that I went over that you didn't catch because I was cutting out? Okay. So electrical systems are another thing that we have to worry about. Simply because there's a lot of different pieces and all of our transmission lines cross our major rivers. So there's the major transmission lines from BPA and PGE that cross the Willamette River down in the area in North Portland, where we expect 25 to 30 feet of movement towards the river due to liquefaction and lateral spread. Both are aware and are working on it, but it is not yet fixed. The other thing with electrical systems as well as water and wastewater systems is the distribution systems to all of our individual houses is very complicated and takes a long time to repair. So it's not something that you can fix right away. There's a lot of distribution system where you have potential for damage. Liquid fuel is specifically a problem here in Southwest Oregon and Washington because 95% of our fuel is stored on the North Willamette in that area I just talked about that's expected to move quite a bit towards the river. So we expect to lose most of it and have it be on the river and very likely on fire. Transportation, all modes of transportation are going to be important after an earthquake. Our system here, the fact that we have lots of mountains and lots of rivers, so we have lots of river crossings, we have lots of areas where we have landslide issues, means the connectivity between a lot of our communities is going to be cut off. So we're going to end up with a lot of different islands. And our transportation systems are often running through those areas of areas where we have issues. Poor soils can be a problem for transportation as well. A lot of times those embankments are built on top of material that slides, so we can have trouble with lateral spread on roads and connections. And then a lot of times we just have, because we have limited corridors, so we tend to put all our utilities in one corridor. So if we have issues along I-84 or out on 26, it's one of the logical places for us to put a road and all of our utilities because that's where you go through the mountains or along a river. But that means we don't have a lot of redundancy in our networks. So coming to Oregon, you know, those are examples of what we saw in other places. Why is that a problem here? And the main reason is we found out, or we determined that these earthquakes were a hazard sometime in the 90s. And they were still arguing about it a little bit, even into the 2000s. So it took a while for us to decide that we had a problem, which means pretty much anything built before 1994 did not consider seismic shaking. So if you think about all of our infrastructure and buildings that were built before 1994, that's where our problem is. And I don't know if any of you have seen a presentation by Chris Goldvinker. He's great. He's one of the geologists down at Oregon State, and he came here in the 90s to prove that Cascadia was not a problem. And every time he goes to do it, he proves himself completely and totally wrong and comes up with it being a little bit worse. So he goes offshore and actually dates core samples of all of the soils down a couple hundred feet offshore, because every time one of these earthquakes happens, you have an earthquake, a little bit of a landslide, and a tsunami. So they can actually carbon date all of these earthquakes. So we have the best documented subduction zone on the planet. We know that we've had 42 events in the last 10,000 years. They range between high 7s all the way up to 9.2. And the most common, the 4 most common breaks are these 4 you see here. So there's the southern half, and this is Oregon up here. So the southern half is still 2/3 of Oregon. This 2/3, which is Oregon, up into getting closer to Seattle, and then the entire thing. And if you can see the yellow over here, these smaller ones happen on average every 230 years. The larger ones are up to 430 years. So for those of you that don't know, the last one happened on January 26th, 1700. So we are 320 into that return period. So as Yume Wong at Dogami likes to say, we're 9.5 months pregnant. So as you can see the 4 main breaks on that fault, which this is 2/3 of Oregon and this is all of Oregon. And these smaller ones happen every 230 years and these happen every 430 years. This timeline here, you'll still get people who will argue whether we're in a break or if there are breaks, and the fact that there were breaks here and then there haven't been really breaks here. This is basically a conveyor belt. We're a blink of an eye on geology's time. There's not as much as data as we have. We can talk about the probability in the last 10,000 years, but that's really still also a blip on geology's timeline. So from a public policy standpoint, from a safety standpoint, and from an engineering standpoint, this is an imminent event that we need to design for, and we need to design for the large one. Especially since in Oregon, even one of the smaller ones, I'm not sure that we'll necessarily know the difference between something here to the larger one, because most of the likelihood that the shaking is mostly off the coast of Oregon is very, very high. So what do we do about it? Resilience is the new word. You'll hear it everywhere. They're applying it to everything, and everybody likes to put it in all of their discussions, which is great. It's the ability to withstand or recover quickly from difficult conditions. So you get hit, you jump back up. I use this picture because you can see there's a ladder right here that goes up. This is the same bridge we saw before that was damaged from liquefaction during the Chilean earthquake. And it was a 5-hour detour if you could not cross this bridge. So there were some people with cars on one side and some people with cars on the other, and to go grocery shopping, they would all drive one side of the bridge, use that ladder to go all the way across the bridge, and then go get groceries in somebody else's car and make it all the way back. So this is bouncing back. It's probably not bouncing back in the way that we would want to for a normal society. And our goal in building resilience in our infrastructure systems is to mitigate hazard and reduce risks so we decrease those response and recovery times. One of the things that, because we are in such a hazard condition here in Oregon, everybody really concentrates on the emergency response. And that's important. If we fix our infrastructure, we don't need that emergency response. So we really need to start looking at both cases. Okay, great, let's be prepared to deal with it as we are, but let's also start fixing things so that it's not as bad. the is response versus recovery. There's response is, how do we get everybody fed, water, and sheltered, right? How do we get to everybody? How do we get debris cleared? And then recovery is, how do we get back up and running? How do we get people back in schools? How do we get people back to their jobs? How do we get your cell phone service back? Because we all know that nobody can handle very long without the phone working. So the main goals for doing resilience type planning and infrastructure, you need to define your hazards. And depending on where you are in the state, those could be entirely different hazards. But in general for Oregon, looking at Cascadia is a pretty good thing to do. You can include a lot of hazards if you're prepped for Cascadia. Define the timelines that you're interested in. So how long do you want it to take for you to be back up and running, to get your roads up and running, your water up and running? Assess your risks to those hazards. Where are our vulnerable locations? And then look at a cost-benefit analysis of fixing it now versus fixing it later. Currently, FEMA's numbers are, for every $1 that you spend in mitigation before an event, you save $6 afterwards, because you don't have to deal with loss of use. You don't have to fix it in a situation where it's more difficult to fix it and more expensive to fix it. So it makes a lot of sense to fix it up front. Prioritize. For especially infrastructure systems, you want to look at your backbone first. You want to get your water transmission line into the city, even if you can't get it to everybody's house. You want to get your electrical from the dam into the cities, even if we can't necessarily get it to everybody's house, but maybe we can get it to the hospitals and a few other important places. So prioritize. Fix the big stuff first and get more resilient as quickly as possible, instead of doing random fixes all over the place. Develop a plan and then take that and put it into all of your long-term planning. Everybody has, even you as a homeowner or a business owner, have a long-term plan, a budget, and a capital improvements plan. You know when you're going to fix the washer or fix the patio or whatever it is. We want to make sure that our infrastructure systems are considering seismic resilience in those plans. So it tends to be an overwhelming problem. There's a lot of different things we can do, and the easiest thing people do is like, let's just let it all fall down and fix it. And I don't want to be here when it all falls down. So I would prefer to actually try to fix some of it up. So how do we do that as quickly as possible? Back to that, fixing your critical facilities. Fix those important things first. Looking at your personnel resources and making sure that, especially from a public works standpoint, an infrastructure standpoint, there's a lot of people that work for the cities and the states and our municipalities, the counties, that don't necessarily fix infrastructure. But after an earthquake, they're probably not going to be doing their regular jobs. So how can they be repositioned so that they can actually help us get ready afterwards? And then where are your service loads? So not just the critical facilities, but also where your big service loads. So unfortunately, those rural areas are probably going to be the last to be fixed, but you want to be getting services to most people as quickly as possible. And with that, there's low-hanging fruit. So if anybody else has a better example of low-hanging fruit, it's been probably 7 years that I've been looking for a good graphic, but this is the best one I've found so far. There are things we can do. Counties and cities have a lot of small single-span bridges that have small fixes that can be done to get them up and running fairly cheaply and often within their regular maintenance budgets. So that's not the big critical facilities, but it can be done on the regular maintenance schedule, and they can get a lot of bridges open quickly after an earthquake. Education and organization beforehand are also two really good examples of low-hanging fruit. It doesn't take a lot of money to educate our public and educate our employees about what to do before and after and how to be prepared so that we can get as up and running as quickly as possible. So that cost-benefit analysis it actually gets reasonably difficult with infrastructure because there's a lot of squishy parts. What value to you is it to have your hospital up and running when you need it? Right? That's a hard number to come up with, but it is something that we try. So we look at what are the values of having a bridge open so that we can actually get across it afterwards? What are the values of having water if we need to fight fires? Looking at human loss and loss of use. Businesses in general, small businesses are insolvent usually, and actually this particular disaster that we're living through right now is going to show us all how this works, but 2 to 4 weeks without income, and a lot of times those businesses don't come back. And most of our economy here is actually small business. Counties and cities they run on gas tax, property tax, and business tax. And if none of those things are working, then they're insolvent within a week, couple weeks to a couple months. So it is actually really important for us to continue living here to actually start to come up with how are we actually fixing these things and making the financial argument for actually doing it now versus later. So a lot of the resilience planning that's been happening is based on this type of idea where we have 3 days to restore emergency services. So everybody's fed, water, and sheltered in 3 days. In 3 weeks, they all have water, food, everybody's going back to school, going back to work. That doesn't mean they may have temporary water lines, and maybe there's some porta potties used, but in general, everybody can start life back up and running. And then in 3 years, we fixed the infrastructure that broke, and we're better for the next event. This was very obviously done in Chile, Japan, and Mexico. They all had large events 20 to 30 years ago, decided that they needed to be better off, and have changed codes and done things, and they had large earthquakes, and with the exception of the tsunami zones, they were up and running within a week to 3 weeks. So it can be done. And that is what we used when we came up with the Oregon Resilience Plan. So both Oregon and Washington have statewide resilience plans. What they basically are is that assessment that says, guess what, we're toast. They looked at all the different utilities, critical businesses, transportation, energy. The numbers were large, tens of thousands of displaced, 10,000 casualties, and that is entirely dependent on when it happens. If this happened on July 4th weekend, we'd lose a lot more people due to the tsunami. If it happened at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we'd lose a lot more people to unreinforced masonry buildings. If it happened at 2 o'clock in the morning on an October Tuesday, that's probably our best case scenario when it comes to casualties. So the numbers are really wide ranging. But we're looking at huge amounts of our GDP, state GDP lost, and months to years of recovery, if not decades. This is and I think all of us that worked on it will tell you that this is optimistic, but months to years of recovery all over the state, especially in areas that are outside of the valley where it gets harder to get to. Washington State, same story. There's a little interesting story here. I'm doing okay on time. Oregon and Washington both have these resilience plans. Washington, San Francisco did one first, and Oregon and Washington said, hey, that's a good idea. We need to do that. Washington's legislature said, that's great. Here's some money. Go do it. And they got a great plan, and they hired a consultant, and he did a great job, and it's a great plan. It sits on a shelf, and almost nobody up there necessarily knows that it's happened, and you don't get a lot of discussion about it. And resilience is important there, but it's not the discussion topic that it is in Oregon. And the reason is because Oregon's legislature said, yeah, we really want one of those, but we don't have any. So yeah, do it, but I don't know how you're going to. The American Society of Civil Engineers and some of my colleagues pulled 170 of us together in the state to write the plan. We volunteered our time in 2011 and 2012 to write the resilience plan. And we have it, and it lives because people from ODOT and Portland Water Bureau and all the counties wrote it and had a piece of it or know somebody who wrote it. I'm not at all advocating that we don't pay our consulting engineers, because I really do think that we're not rolling in money, so it'd be nice if we got paid for our services. But this one particular example is a really good idea of how getting the right people involved makes a document a living document. We now have a state resilience officer. We're the only state to have, actually Colorado got one too. So we're one of 2 states to have a state resilience officer that is funded through the state and is not funded by the Rockefellers. We talk about it on a regular basis. The governor has put forward several bills that are actually considering seismic resilience. And so we're currently being used as one of the top examples, even over California, for at least how we're looking at resilience planning. Whether or not we have the money to be doing the fixes is a whole nother thing, but we are at least in the forefront of talking about these things and going forward. That is positive. So one of the problems we have with it, though, is that all of these places that I went have earthquake culture. Everybody knows they live with earthquakes. Everybody knows earthquakes are there. There's no doubt. There's no question. There's some people saying, let's just let it all fall down and move on, right? Because they have earthquakes on a regular basis. So they talk about it, they know what happens, they've seen it, their grandmother lived through it. It happened, it all fell down, and they built it back, and they know that that can happen. We unfortunately are not living in that situation. We are desperately trying to get people to be scared of something that they've never seen. And that's much harder. So there are things, after the last earthquake that Mexico had, they developed evacuation plans and drills. They can evacuate a 10-story building in 2 minutes there once their earthquake early warning hits off. It's amazing. I've talked to teachers about that here, and they just laugh hysterically at that. Namely because they say, well, I can barely get my kids out. They're trained. We do it on a regular basis, and they listen. I can't imagine what you'd actually get a building full of adults to do, right? We're not good at following directions. They developed their earthquake early warning system. So now most Mexico City and a large portion of the area around Mexico City has an earthquake early warning system. They all know exactly what it sounds like, and they know what to do. Namely, it goes off and they all evacuate. They changed their building codes to require retrofits, to require higher standards for new buildings. And they put additional requirements in for their buildings so that they change their building codes to be better than standard. Then they have global education initiatives, and just to get the information out to everybody in all of the languages that are down in Mexico, including the indigenous languages, and they have very comprehensive education pieces, and it's awesome. So this is a really good example of how you actually develop that earthquake culture. We've discussed this with Multnomah County and City of Portland, and we talked about it a little bit. I'll talk about it in a little bit, how we've had issues here. Convincing people that this is something that needs to be important. And some of my examples would be, well, let's just in Mexico, any of these areas, if you look at an elevator, it says do not use the elevator in case of earthquake or fire. That doesn't do anything other than every time people look at an elevator, they know they live in an earthquake zone. Starting to change the language of our signing and our safety signing. This is a safe zone that my colleague here is standing on in Mexico City. So they do have a lot of unreinforced masonry buildings and older structures. So they have things painted on the ground where it's safe to go and congregate when you evacuate, so that you know that you're not in an area where you could have a facade or something fall on you. Our tsunami evacuation things on the coast, my comment is paint the whole damn street blue with big arrows on it so you can see it from Google. So nobody has any question where they're supposed to go afterwards. It doesn't have to be every street, but if you're walking through downtown Florence, Reedsport have looked at these. Those are small enough towns you can get uphill. If you walk through downtown and you see the one blue street and if something happens, you're gonna remember where you're supposed to go and get uphill. So more aggressive signage, more aggressive information. We're in a time where everybody wants to see everything and have all of the information. So how do we do that? Putting signs on bridges that says do not cross in the event of an earthquake until inspected. That does absolutely nothing to anybody's liability. It doesn't say one way or the other whether the bridge is good or not, but when somebody drives over 26 bridges on their way to work, they're going to think about the fact that, hey, wait a minute, I'm probably not going to be able to get home after an earthquake, right? So how is it that we start to tell people and to make it just normal that we live in an earthquake zone, so that when we come and try to do some of these initiatives, nobody's having a problem about it, and you would not believe how many people, both elected officials, others, like, well, you don't want to scare people. I said, well, we're really, really good at building in hurricane zones over and over and over again, and going to where there's tornadoes and people go and watch the tornadoes. Humans are not really all that great about being scared. We have a beautiful coastline. I'm sure that people are going to come and continue to visit. We just need to have them be educated with what to do if it happens while they're there. ODOT has done a lot of work since, actually, they started before the Oregon Resilience Plan. They were on top of it. They started right after Chile. They have looked at their entire system, and again, instead of seismically retrofitting randomly around state, they have developed a lifeline system that is based on where their infrastructure is and where the population is. And they've come up with they've tiered their system of importance, and then they've come up with phases of how it's going to be fixed, so that they can fix the most important things first, or get the most connectivity in line as quickly as possible. And one of those things is they're concentrating currently on Highway 97 on the other side of the mountains, because that is actually the best way to get through Oregon from north to south without, as cheaply as possible. It's that low-hanging fruit. Is you have less seismic shaking to deal with, you have less bridges, and you have less mountains on that particular highway. And so they are concentrating on getting that one solid, so that that will at least be up and running, and then we can get to urban airport back and forth and start to figure out how to get it over the mountains. They are also working on retrofits other places. There are sections of I-5 and 205 that they've been doing, but they have a system so that they can get as much, they're using their money as intelligently as possible. So when they get the money, it's going to the most important thing first, and they go down the list. And this is what pretty much everybody has to do in your businesses, in your home, and then all of our infrastructure systems. There's a lot of water improvements going on. There were some federal regulations that require resilience planning and assessments. And then there's some discussion in the Oregon Resilience Plan that encourages this as well. And our water systems have taken it to heart. Portland itself has done a lot of work. They have a full seismic assessment and resilience plan going, and are doing a lot of work to fix and get more seismically resilient, focusing on that backbone and the reservoirs. The Halton Valley Water District out west, City of Beaverton, a lot of these places are doing these seismic assessments and actually coming through and doing fixes as well. Astoria has done a transmission line study to figure out what their hazards are for their main water transmission line, which for them is actually more landslides than earthquakes, but could be both at the same time. So we've done that. And then water systems are actually they are actually using earthquake early warning. So earthquake early warning is here. It is functioning on some level, and I'll talk about it a little more detail in a minute, but they are actually using it in water systems so that they get the warning, the system makes a decision about, okay, I have this earthquake coming at this time, I expect this amount of shaking, shutting down valves to reservoirs so we don't lose water, shutting off pumps so that we don't damage them so that they're not functioning during shaking. Water and wastewater systems are actually very aggressively installing the system. There, as of yet, is not somebody who's actually got the entire system, the decision-making piece, but they are installing it and they're starting to think about how to use it in their systems. And this is true all over Oregon and Washington. DOGAMI, which is the state Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Industries, they have done full damage assessments for both the Cascadia event and a Portland Hills Fault event, which is our largest hazard for a crustal event, a 6.7 right down the middle of Portland. For those of you that wonder why there's mountains right next to the valley, that's the fault. It's quite obvious that it's there. So they looked at both scenarios, and they did huge amounts of mapping for planning that talk about where they expect damage, based on shaking for both events. I think this actually is the Portland's Fault one. Ground shaking, ground movement, and then they look at building capacity and URMs to come up with where the debris are. So our emergency managers in the 5 counties in the metro area, including Carter County, Washington, now have significantly more data to start actually planning the response. The Oregon Department of Aviation has started doing resilience assessments of smaller airports, knowing that PDX has done a lot of work. The Port of Portland has done a lot of work at PDX and done a resilience assessment there and at their Hillsborough Airport. They have prioritized PDX and are making active improvements. They expect to have a working runway in 20 years. It's going to take that long. The whole area is on really crappy fill, and the levee is a major problem, so they have a lot of work to do. And they are actively making decisions with each structure that they're doing, whether they're building it to code or above code, because they want it to be working afterwards. So like the new rental car parking lot is built to code, but they're doing above and beyond that for areas of the terminal and other improvements because they want to build to a higher code to make sure that it's working. So but it will be a while before PDX is running, and we have a lot of other airports around the state. So the Oregon Department of Aviation and the State Resilience Officer's Office are looking at trying to build resilience in some of the smaller airports to get supply out faster. Hospitals, especially hospitals along the coast, DOGAMI is working with them to look at water options, and the state, DOGAMI and the state are like, water is very, very important for hospitals. So you can do emergency wells so that they have water supply. You can work with the water system if they have a solid transmission line so that the hospitals get water first. They're looking at more resilient power options. They're looking at better planning so that the hospital itself is 3 weeks ready, which is has not necessarily been true to this point. They usually have a 72-hour ready rule, but we're looking at let's extend that. And then new hospitals are considering better and above design. Now, hospitals in general are built to a higher standard. but they're not all of the hospital. And then they also have to look at all the non-structural components and other things. So there's a lot that they can do when they construct hospitals to make them more resilient. We have statewide fuel planning happening, knowing that that's going to be one of the #1 problems that we have for recovery, and is that we need fuel to run those generators and all the equipment that's going to be getting things back up and running. So looking at diversifying our system, maybe hardening a couple of the pipelines that come in. They're looking at some of those options, and they're not getting a ton of help from the oil companies themselves, but we're working on it. So we are also looking at resilient buildings. Buildings built to code right now, like actual building, international building code and state building codes, in general, are meant to not kill anybody and to basically be there when they're done without collapsing. They are not built to be usable afterwards. So the general thought is like life safety building will require about 20 to 40% of its original construction cost to fix it afterwards. It'll be weeks to months before it's up and running. That's really unacceptable if it's one of our new buildings, when all of our old buildings will be having problems. So there are entities that are looking at trying to build buildings to a higher standard. And so the state is looking at building 2 resilient buildings. Beaverton School District has been doing a lot of work to have more resilient structures, knowing they're going to be shelters. So this is a conversation that's been happening since the Oregon Resilience Plan. And the other money number is that in order to build it structurally so that it can be immediate occupancy, it's usually an addition of 1 to 2% maximum at the start of construction. So when you look at the money side, you're back to, it's a lot cheaper to do it right the first time than it is to fix it later. Oregon and Washington both have post-disaster assessment now. So this was one of the big complaints we got in Mexico City, was that the people who come out and red and yellow tag buildings to tell them whether it's safe to go into them or not were not organized. They had a bunch of different problems getting people there. Some weren't educated. They were not consistent. These are examples of the red, yellow, and green tags. So this one right here, this is a green tag that's crossed out and made a red tag. Now, it's very common for somebody to red tag it, and a structural engineer comes back and does a more detailed association and says, you know what, this one's okay, and that's fine. What you don't want is somebody telling you it's okay to go in when it's really a red tag. This is a yellow tag, and the reason that I know this is a yellow tag is because this is an A down here. And A, yellow in Spanish is amarillo. Well, this is green paint. So that's a problem. This is the same thing. This is tag amarillo, which is a yellow tag in green paint. So very confusing. California's had a very consistent program that has tags and rules and a training program. Both Oregon and Washington now have these programs. Oregon has not funded theirs yet. So that's one thing you could do, is get a hold of your representative on every level and tell them that they need to frickin' fund it. It's cheap and it's a volunteer program. It's a very minimal. I think we asked for $200,000 a year, which in a budget scheme of everything is very low. And once we have it up and running and trained, that's probably going to go down, because it just gets some time to get the program started. But we have not had anybody that is willing to fund this. I'm fighting for it for 2 years. So that's one place you can help. That's the continued struggle. So there's, yay, we have one, and unfortunately it's not funded. This is the code side. So we've got the code in general is no collapse to life safety. So we expect a lot of damage. There's been a lot of trouble. You guys have probably paid attention to the URM fundings where the city of Portland wasn't allowed to tag unsafe buildings in any way. We've had trouble trying to get people to accept tsunami codes and new tsunami data. We have not accepted the new tsunami code and engineering codes here in Oregon because the Coastal Caucus has blocked us, and others have blocked us. We do not require retrofits unless you are looking at a big enough overhaul of your building, and to that point, even the required retrofit level is really only to this no collapse life safety, which may depend on the building, but there's not very strategic thought process with it. So in general, some of these things would be helping with that side. We keep getting resistance of everybody saying, you can't tell everybody it's not safe. And that's a problem because it's not safe. And you know, we tell everybody there's a fire hazard. I think we need to tell everybody there's an earthquake hazard as well. So everybody in Mexico can evacuate pretty darn quickly. We have earthquake early warning. The governor has said that she wants it within the next, I think, 3 years. Definitely by 2025, but I think she wanted it by 2023. The problem we have with earthquake early warning is we don't have a population that's educated enough to know what to do with it. So if you can imagine being 2 o'clock in the afternoon in the middle of Portland and everybody's cell phone goes off saying there's going to be strong shaking, what do you think is going to happen? You don't necessarily know if it's going to happen right away, or if the subduction zone started far away, you could get a couple minutes of warning. So there's a lot of controversy right now with what do we do with that warning and what do we tell people. I see people running out of unreinforced masonry buildings where they could potentially get killed by the falling facade where they would have been safer inside, or people doing very stupid things off bridges and hurting themselves. We do not have the ability right now to handle that information in a safe way. So the governor's budget that didn't pass because of all of the politics gymnastics were, nothing passed this year, including the governor's budget that had an education money to develop an education system for this. So we need a statewide education system so that people know what to do and to decide what the message is, because there is some possibility of getting 1 minute to 3 minutes of warning. And if you have 1 minute to 3 minutes of warning, you have some decisions that you can make to make yourself safer. So there's some definitely things that we need to decide and we need to do before we can handle earthquake early warning, because we are not prepped like Mexico and Japan. And then we also just have to think about our infrastructure. The United States is a really good job of funding things on a 2 to 4 year election cycle. It's all what's in the budget. And a really good example of this paving is if you took apart an entire road and reconstructed it the right way, you could do like Europe does and have roads last for 20 to 30 years, even with studded tires. We do a lot of grind down 2 inches and put another 2 inches of asphalt on it because it's cheap, it fits within our 2-year budget. Some of that things that I've been talking about is that's having to look at our infrastructure from a life cycle way, which is how they do it in a lot of places around the world that are not quite as fun as it is here. They say in 50 years, what disasters are going to happen in that time, and how much is it going to have to cost me to maintain this, and does it make sense to spend more right now? Yes, it's spending more right now, but it's significantly less over the life cycle of that infrastructure than if I have to continually maintain it and fix it after 2 earthquakes. So this is how we have to start thinking about infrastructure, have to start talking to our politicians and our public, frankly, of let's talk about how we're spending our money and let's do it as intelligently as possible, because doing it little bits at a time is not necessarily the smartest way to do it. Fighting apathy is another question, is how do we get people to believe something that is not visibly in front of them when we have COVID and Black Lives Matters and whatever other disaster is going to happen in the next month, I'm afraid to ask. But how do we start to prepare them for something like this so that we can actually talk about it reasonably as a society and start to prepare? And then just starting to prioritize resilience with education and life cycle costs.
I guess I'll start out with the first question, and then Ingrid will call on the questioners based on them typing things in chat. So I would imagine either with the city of Portland or the state of Oregon, they fairly quickly at least put together some kind of plan if an earthquake happened during the pandemic, what the plan would be, and can you just kind of give an update on their thinking about that?
So I honestly don't know if they have that plan. There are plans for what they do during an earthquake. Honestly, pandemic might be the best possible time for it to happen because we are all in our homes and we are all already isolated. Wood frame homes in general do fairly well. Plus, we're all sitting here with lots of toilet paper and hopefully we've stocked up the grocery store. So it may actually be the best time for it to happen. Now,
I'll just skip it out.
There's also issues after an earthquake of all sorts of other diseases that come up with, you know, you've got all kinds of problems with sanitation and other things. So those things are in the plan. They are so busy developing the COVID plan right now. I honestly doubt that they have a plan for what happens if it happens during COVID. Honestly, if they got COVID people and had to be on hospitals, they'd just be farming them out to somewhere that would take them. Probably a hospital ship off the shore. I think that the plans themselves would probably very easily merge into one so that they could figure out how to do it. But in general, this is like, not that I want it to happen. Actually, I should stop saying that because God only knows what's going to happen next month, and let's just not say it. But there are a lot of benefits for everybody being at home when the earthquake happens. And then just from the wood frame house side, the main thing from wood frame houses, this is a question I get a lot. They do really, wood's flexible. It does fairly well. The problem is it jumps the foundation. So for most houses in the Portland area, now there are some with brick foundations and some with older foundations that could have some foundation issues, but retrofitting our houses, especially if you have an open basement or a crawl space, is actually reasonably easy and not super expensive unless you have a really complicated design or a really, really old foundation. There's a ton of contractors out there that are doing it now. Angie's List or somewhere is a great place to do it. My recommendations, if you're going to do it, is get 3 to come look at it and give you a quote. And if for some reason one is higher or more complicated or all totally different, I would get a structural engineer to look at them and give you some ideas. In general, they should all be about the same and they should all propose the same thing. If for some reason they're coming up with totally different things, that means you probably have a more complicated engineering solution, and that's probably worth getting a structural engineer to come in and direct them.
Okay, thank you. It looks like the next question is from Al.
Yes, about the West Hills. I had a friend who used to live in Hillsdale. He was a retired physics professor, about 70 years old, and he was in some kind of a voluntary post-disaster assessment program where he told me his job after an earthquake was to get to one of those really tall bridges on Barber Boulevard and decide whether or not it should stay open and put tape across it if it shouldn't or something like that, try to close the road. Is that still in business? And the other thing is one other question is, how much of a problem is it for Portland that we have our biggest hospital sitting on top of those hills, and they're not going to be really very accessible, and Emmanuel is the next closest hospital and it's right next to the river?
That's a lot to handle, so let me try to go in order. Everybody who owns bridges, and so I don't know about your friend, but everybody who owns bridges, cities, counties, state, have a plan to go and look at their bridges after an earthquake. And so that will be the biggest bridges first and then go down from there. They'll look at the most critical ones first, and that's ones that will be on lifelines. So there are identified emergency transportation routes that will be evaluated first, and then they will go from there. And they have structural engineers that are bridge engineers that will go and do the evaluations. The fire departments also have some training to look at bridges so that they can go and look at the bridge and make sure there's no major problems before they drive their trucks over it, because they're really heavy trucks. And then in general, there's some discussion too. I know, like, I'm actually working with Clackamas County right now to develop a plan for what their disaster response is, but everybody's in the process of figuring out how to do that. But the bridges in general, all of the bridge groups, Multnomah County, all the counties, all the cities, they have a plan for how to do it. Whatever it requires and whether the people are at work or home or whatever, how it happens might be a little bit fudged in the beginning, but there is at least a plan. West Hills. So the West Hills actually are there, and there's actually a decent amount of basalt rock in the West Hills. So the West Hills are not all bad. The rock will handle it well. It will be sharp shaking, but the rock itself is pretty good. The problem ends up is when you have a lot of soil over that rock that is not secure, and that's where we end up getting West Hills landslides. So depending on where you live in the West Hills and how things are constructed, there are places that are not at risk because of topography and geography, geologic conditions. I can't speak today. There are places that are at risk because of those issues. And there are places where like there are like Terwilliger Plaza is built through the soil into the rock, and bolted into the rock, so that that's going to be okay because it's not on the soil that will move. So it depends on the design of where you are and how they did the houses. A lot of those houses like right up on the front are all in rock. So if their foundations were designed for it or retrofitted, they may be okay. Now, the hospital up there, all of our hospitals, every single one of them is kind of an organic structure where they had one hospital and then they built a whole bunch of other buildings. All of them have newer buildings that are more likely to be up and around, and they have older buildings that are most likely to be heavily damaged. I cannot speak to which ones are more important in which hospital campus. But generally, there are some facilities on all of the hospital campuses that are better off, and there are some that are in danger. OHSU is right up there. They have some very new structures that were designed to new hospital standards or new office building standards that will not, that may or may not be up and running afterwards. And they have some that are really not very good at all because of when they were constructed. That itself, they're up in a spot on the top of the hill. Most of their buildings are big enough that they've gone down into the rock that's up there, so that at least the foundation and sliding down the hill is not necessarily a problem. It's more of an age of the building problem. I was actually involved in the design of the tram, and that has been designed for seismic conditions as a lifeline type structure. I wouldn't necessarily use it afterwards, but they have designed it so that it is safe if it happens during the event. They may be up there for a while. I would not want to be on the tram when it happened, but the company that built it as well has built in other seismic areas, so it is constructed for that. So hospitals are definitely a weakness, and getting to all of our hospitals is going to be a problem, especially OHSU, but they are looking at the access to OHSU as an emergency transportation route right now, regionally, and I know because I'm actually doing that work. And the recommendations, once we get that project done, where we identify what the emergency transportation routes, the next step is to harden those transportation routes. So I honestly don't know what the vulnerabilities are of the road that goes up there. I know the potential ones, but I don't know for sure what they are. But the recommendation that will come out of our work is these are the recommended emergency transportation routes. These are the recommended detours that you should have until you fix the original ones. And this is the way that you should be fixing them. So not ready yet, but people are working on it.
I live in an 8-story apartment building that was built in the early 1960s. And it's reinforced concrete. And we had a meeting here a few years ago from a neighborhood group sponsored by the city to talk about earthquakes. And I asked at that meeting if there were any recommendations about what to do in this building if an earthquake occurred, where to go if it occurred rapidly inside the building, and whether it's best to go out in the street. They didn't know, this group that came to talk to us about an earthquake, but they recommended the city has a program where I think the city investigates private homes and makes recommendations about reinforcement for earthquakes. I called the city and asked if they had somebody to come out, a structural engineer, to look at this building and make recommendations to us about what to do if an earthquake occurred. And the city said, no, we don't do that. We don't go to commercial buildings and do that. And that kind of stopped me. I talked to people at Portland State and asked if they had any graduate students who were interested in a little project to analyze a building and its behavior under an earthquake, and that didn't go very far either, but they recommended it.
You want to pay somebody to do that. You want to pay a structural engineer that is qualified to do that, to look at your building. And it doesn't have to be super expensive. I have people that I can recommend that do it. Reinforced concrete from the 60s is likely a major hazard. The basic information now, especially if you feel shaking, is it's duck, cover, and hold. So the number one thing that you need to do is duck, cover, and hold. You want to protect yourself. The triangle of life, don't pay attention to that. You want to, hopefully you have some furniture that's a little heftier than IKEA furniture, but get under something that is solid so that you are protected from your head, etc. So that if rubble and other things happen, you are in a safe place and protected from that. And then from there, you can go and evacuate. Honestly, I don't know exactly what the construction type is when you say reinforced concrete, because there's multiple different types. Some of those can be very, very hazardous. And in those cases, there are structural engineers that will tell you, if we do get an earthquake early warning system and you have 2 minutes, get the hell out of that building. And that's kind of the decision that you're going to have to make. And knowing the conversations that are having at the state level, I'm going to be really surprised if anybody gets away from duck cover and hold until we have a significantly better understanding of our condition and the condition of our buildings. But reinforced concrete from the 50s, 60s, and 70s is one of the more hazardous types of buildings. If there are some that are okay, but the majority of them have, and it's connections. So the floor, ceiling, wall connections are not sufficient. So you get a lot of damage and a lot of catastrophic damage, which means that's a condition where there are places in the subduction zone earthquake where we might get enough warning that you could get people out of those buildings. That is still a hazard, because if you're in an unreinforced masonry building, if you can't get outside of the facade, you're safer in the building, because those a lot of times are wood frame and you can get and hold yourself and the facades fall out. So the question, that's one of the big questions, is Beaverton Schools is one of the ones that's pushing it, is they say we have all kinds of buildings, and our tilt up concrete buildings, we want people out of those. But they're going to have to make that decision to be separate from the state and have a different discussion of teaching their teachers. If you're in this building, you do this. If you're in that building, you do that. But reinforced concrete from the 50s, 60s, and 70s is one of those controversial building types. So I would have a structural engineer come and take a look at it. And my email, I'm sure, is hanging around somewhere, and you've got it. Just send me an email. I'll send you some names of potential structural engineers. Probably be a few $1,000s, but in general, like, they just need to look at some plans and take a look at it and let you know that that you've got some issues.
Thank you.
Is there any kind of plans to educate the people on how to evacuate properly from the city, or what's the best way to get out of your home and where to go? Is there any kind of training out there to do that now, or? Not
yet. The official training from everybody in the state right now is duck cover and hold during the earthquake, and then get out where you can safely afterwards. It is very similar to what a fire hazard would be. If you have a fire plan for your house, building, etc., you should follow that for earthquake, with some minor exceptions. There's not, that education program I was talking about, I think would probably start to address some of those things about earthquake early warning, but like I said, we didn't get anything passed this year, so it hasn't happened. Hopefully that will happen next year, and we'll start to develop some of those programs. But there are a lot of information. There's a lot of information on your city, county, state, and FEMA preparedness for earthquakes sites. There's all kinds of information online. If you go into Dogami's offices, they have quite a bit of information. And then, yeah, the Office of Emergency Management has a lot of stuff that's out there. So there is a lot of information about the other things to do. Now, when it comes to evacuating the city, they don't have a plan to evacuate the city because they don't know where they're going to put you, right? Okay. We don't have a place to go right now. So that's going to be developed kind of as the hazard happens. Now, that said, usually if they're not planning on a mass evacuation. They're planning on evacuating those, especially for us in the valley. There probably will be some major evacuation on the tsunami zone side on the coast, because it will be years before anybody even gets out to there. And then medical evacuations. But there's not, the plan is not to have a mass evacuation out of the city of Portland to go somewhere else during an earthquake. There's nowhere to get us there. There's no way to feed us once they get us there, and they don't know where to put us. So the plan is to make it so that you can be in your home. So this last 3 months was really good practice. You can spend, just maybe for practice, just say, okay, earthquake just happened. Here I am in my home. I can't go anywhere. What does it look like for the next week? Do I have enough water? Do I have a plan? Do I have my 2 buckets? That is the official project. The official, we recommend that you go online prior to the earthquake and print out the recommendations for the 2 bucket bathroom plan. prior to the earthquake, because you're not going to be able to afterwards. So that is the wastewater plan for most of Oregon, is you in your backyard.
Okay, then there's a comment from Polly, and I'm guessing that she retrofitted her house, and she said it cost me $7,000 a few years ago. And then the next question is from Joyce.
One of the things that you haven't mentioned is the NET program in Portland. I'm NET trained, which is, I believe the term is NET, Neighborhood Emergency Team. And when I first joined that group, there were only a few of us, and now there are even more people on my block. But we're a volunteer group, so we probably don't train enough. I don't necessarily feel that I could run out and do things I should do. I don't know where our caches are, for example, but I know which park to go to and how to set up a system that would have a medical section and a child care section and maps, someone setting up, working with maps. What's your opinion of that? Do you know about that program, and can it be better run than it is right now?
I think that program's great, and I think it's well done. That it basically is setting us up to take care of ourselves. I think probably more people need to be involved, and I think that the NET members that are there probably need to do some more work within their neighborhoods. Have you guys had a neighborhood meeting so everybody knows who you are and how to prep and build your maps?
Not as much as we need.
Yeah, that's really the big one is, this education piece, we can all sit back and wait for the government to do it. But we can also take something into our own hands. So the OPB special that he mentioned in my introduction is called Unprepared, and you can stream it online. And it's a really good way to have a bunch of, well, not now, but when we can do this, maybe all well masked and in plastic bubbles, or an online Zoom meeting where you watch it online and then discuss. Watch the Unprepared and then have a discussion about it afterwards. And that way there's a movie involved and people like to come. But we're going to be it's going to be, I think it's going to be days before you see any help. And if you do see a fire or police officer driving by in the first few days, they're not going to stop and help you. They are doing surveys and trying to figure out where everything is and give some information back to bring help in. So we are on our own. Just assume you're on your own for 2 weeks, and you and your neighborhoods need to be prepared. Our neighbors are going to be our biggest asset. So getting to know them, getting to know who's medically trained, getting to know who's NET trained, mapping your neighborhood so you know where everybody's gas is, so you can go around and help people turn off their water and their gas so that they don't get floods and leaks. All of that is stuff that we can do as neighbors. And the more that we do to get to know our neighbors and get to know how, what we can do at home and educate them, the better off we're going to be. Thank you, Joyce. Good point.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Polly.
Yeah, I wonder about this seismic retrofitting. How safe does that make your house after you do it? Should I still stay in and duck under my table, or should I go out?
So if you feel shaking, duck, cover, and hold. The likelihood that you're going to be able to run during the shaking out of whatever you're in, and get out safely without things falling on you and getting through doors and windows breaking, like just duck, cover, and hold no matter what. If for some reason we get earthquake early warning and you want to make that decision based on how much time it tells you that you're going to have before strong shaking, that's a different answer. But our wood frame houses do really well if they don't jump their foundation. And even if they do jump their foundation, the likelihood that they're going to collapse is very low. So if you're in a wood frame house or even 2 or 3 story building or apartment structure, in general, they do pretty well because they're very flexible structures. So, what?
Mine is pretty old.
Even if they're old, wood itself is fairly flexible, and it does pretty well. So the likelihood that you're going to have a huge collapse in a wood frame structure is actually quite low. The problem is they bumped their foundation, but that means you just have to get out of it and you might not be able to go back into it. So my recommendation for that is always stay in. The retrofits, in that case, if you have a decent foundation and a retrofit, it actually makes it pretty darn good that your house will be just fine afterwards if you can strap it to the foundation and if you need to do some retrofits to the foundation. that actually makes it pretty darn safe. It's one of the better ones. The wood frame houses and wood frame smaller structures are one of the easier ones to retrofit. Where it gets hard is the reinforced concrete buildings, and actually hard and expensive. So there's the cost benefit analysis of how expensive it is to fix things all the way to immediate occupancy afterwards versus no collapse. So that's where it gets to the point where people are making decisions about whether they just get it to the point where the building won't collapse or they'll have safe zones within the building. That's usually because it's really, really expensive to actually get all the way done.
I'm curious about the cluster of earthquakes around Stanley, Idaho. How do those compare, aside from the fact that Stanley, Idaho is sparsely populated even by Idaho standards?
Yeah.
As compared to Portland, the Portland metro area. How do those earthquakes compare? And is there any message for us in terms of, is that a forewarning of things that may be coming to Portland, or is that totally unrelated?
So no, it's all related. The problem is that we've been paying attention to this for 20 years. And earthquakes in general, we've had monitoring things since maybe the 70s in areas that have more earthquakes than we do. We've had our array up here from the USGS, I think, since the late 90s. We don't have the data to know. It is very likely that there is some very obvious pattern to this happens and then that happens and then this happens. We just don't know what it is. And unfortunately, we're going to have 3 or 4 earthquakes to be able to tell what that is. So there isn't a time in our lifetime where we're going to be able to say, you know what, this happened and then this happened. Chile did not have any foreshocks. Japan had 2 foreshocks. But again, Japan didn't even know that that meant that they were going to have a larger one because they have 7.0 earthquakes all the time. So it's just, we don't have enough data to be able to say one way or the other. The entire thing is connected. We've had earthquakes all the way around the Pacific Rim in the last 10 years. So why aren't we moving? I don't know. I would think that would mean that we're probably the ones that are just waiting on. I mean, they had a huge subduction zone earthquake in Alaska, Japan. They have had several in the Russia area where there's, again, sparsely populated. Mexico, the 2004, Chile, Peru. I mean, we've just had them all the way around the Ring of Fire except where we are. So I don't know why that doesn't mean that we're probably not overdue. All we can see is just the data that we do have. Idaho, those earthquakes can very potentially happen here. A couple of them were probably pretty similar to the spring breakquake we had in 94. It was a 5.6.
93. It was 93.
93. It did a lot of damage to bridges. It collapsed Malala High School's gym, and that was a 5.6. There are the potential, we typically design for the potential of between a 6 and a 7 anywhere on the crustal faults that are near to the project that we're designing in Western Oregon, because we have that potential at any particular time. Now, those earthquakes tend to have longer recurrence intervals than Cascadia. Cascadia is on a plate. It's on a very badly greased conveyor belt, but it is technically a conveyor belt. So that one is the one that is more we know that it's going to happen at any particular time. The other piece with that is if we're designing for Cascadia, we're designing for an entire Northwest event where we won't have help. If we have a smaller earthquake, and by small, I mean, it may be as much damage in Portland, if not more damage in Portland than we will have from a Cascadia event, but Seattle won't be damaged, California won't be damaged. People will be able to come in and get here and help us. It will just be localized damage. So from an emergency management standpoint, we usually look at the big one because we have a major problem and we have no help. That's the worst case scenario. But yeah, when it comes to the different earthquakes that happen, I mean, if you watch the spreading ridge, they happen all the time. And if we have, pretty much if you have an earthquake, the chance that you're gonna have another earthquake on that fault goes up. And I can't remember what the percentages are about whether it's gonna be bigger or smaller, but any earthquake could potentially be a foreshock to a larger earthquake, assuming that it's not the biggest earthquake that you could have on that fault. It could also just be an earthquake and then you have aftershocks. That is one of the other things to think about is from aftershocks, because Japan didn't stop shaking for a day. Chile had 130 magnitude 6+ earthquakes in the week after their earthquake. Aftershocks are going to be a problem as well. Chile actually had 2 inland faults that were activated due to the subduction zone earthquake. One of them had a 7.2,
Oh, wow.
a lot of damage the week after the earthquake. So when we have Cascadia, that's not over. It's going to keep shaking. Michael, you comment about your house built in 1910 with a full finished basement, lath and plaster walls. Really, the only thing that matters is that it's 1910 and whether you have concrete or brick.
It's concrete.
Walls. So that's better than brick. It still probably doesn't have very much steel in it. So they may have some general recommendations to prevent. Does it have a wall above? Is there concrete above the soil, or is it wood above the soil?
It is concrete above the soil, yeah.
Okay, so there's a weakness there because it's a connection where you could have a collapse there, and there's ways to fix that by making sure that the supports around the rest of the house are in shape. So the fact that it's finished makes it more expensive because you have to get through the finishing, but sometimes they can do it on the outside. My parents' neighbor's house did it on the outside, and it wasn't very obtrusive because they were able to do it in a way that they didn't have to tear up the whole finished basement. I have an unfinished basement, so it was really easy to go in there. So $7,000, what quote is in there, sounds probably somewhere in the middle. Mine, I was probably less than $3,000 to do mine because I have an open basement, so that it gets all of it. If you have a crawl space, it's about the same thing. It just kind of depends on how easy it is to get in and do what they need to do.
Okay, it's actually, my basement is very easy to get into, and what was I going to say? I was wondering if the strapping would be something one could do on one's own if they have the time.
You can, and by getting into the basement, I mainly mean that you probably have finishing and sheetrock and other things that are nice.
No, actually, most of the I don't, maybe I used the wrong term, finished basement, but it's a full open base. Well, not open basement.
Yeah, and you can. The only hard part is you need a drill and epoxy to be able to do epoxy. So I actually had my handyman because he had the equipment, and he and I did it. And then if you have supports in the middle, yes. I've had different arguments on different people, but I brought a structural engineer in, and we jacked it up the middle. Y'all see it? The middle beam in my house, we jacked it up, and then I put connections top and bottom to those so that, because they were just there by gravity. So that's, if I have any weaknesses around the side in my concrete wall, that is at least solid. And then it's strapped to the foundation, and the floor is strapped to the joists. And all of that could be easily done. City of Portland actually has a really good how to manual in their section. I think you can just, I find it on Google fairly easily. They have there is a permit you can get. You don't have to get a permit, but it has a pretty good step-by-step process on how to do it. And if you have the right equipment, it's fairly easy.
Okay, actually, when I first bought my house, the man who did the assessment of things that needed, the only thing he mentioned about earthquakes to me was strapping the hot water heater to one of the support beams, which has already been done. He didn't mention anything about strapping the house all around, so I don't know whether that was negligence on his part or whether he felt it wasn't quite as necessary.
It may just have not been. When did you buy it?
December of 2001.
Yeah, it was early enough that they just weren't doing a ton of them.
Okay.
So he just probably, they weren't doing a lot of retrofits here. But yeah, definitely anybody, if it's built before 1994, there needs to be some strapping. And in the 80s and 90s and even into early 2000s, 94 to 97, you should be okay if it was built after that. If it was built before that, it may have some strapping. You just want to make sure that you have enough. So it's get an evaluation from a structural engineer or a contractor.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Allison.
I'm glad it's appreciated. You guys are all now my people, so you have to go spread the word.
Okay, thank you, Allison.
Well, Allison, I have a question then, because we live down in Salem. what does Salem have going for it as far as, you know, teaching us to how to do things?
Yeah, really kind of all of the same stuff. I think City of Salem's actually doing, it's a little bit different than Portland, but they're doing a lot of the same things.
Okay.
There's still the same weakness on every level. And this is true for all municipalities in all of Oregon and Washington, you know, like they know about it, they're working on it. Everybody's doing things a little bit differently, but they are going forward. Your emergency manager is great. He's awesome. Marion County's emergency management is top notch. So you've got a lot of support down there, and they I'm sure have websites, and I've worked with them to do presentations as well, and they do work. So I know most of the emergency managers around the state, and they're all doing the best they can to educate everybody. It's just, there is only so much money and only so much time. And we really just need, it's gonna, when it comes from your neighbor, it's gonna be more important than coming from an emergency manager, right? When you actually talk about these things. And if you wanna do some sort of education piece, please get a hold of me. I'll help you find whatever you need to help do a meeting with your neighbors.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.